You never know what comes to mind when you read texts and where the Spirit will take you. But I was thinking when this whole presentation of Jesus and the parents, proud parents, bringing a baby to the temple, I was thinking that probably one of the most important things, and actually one of the most difficult things anyone does as a parent, and that list seems enormous at times and boundless, is naming your child. Is that right? I think naming your child is interesting, to say the least. I mean, do you remember the somersaults involved in achieving that, or were Jean and I just unique in that regard? She would come up with a name, and I would say, no, you can't do that because Jim will be Slim Jim, and what if he isn't? Things like that pop into your mind, or somebody says Susan. Oh, no, I dated a Susan once. We're not using that name, And, of course, there's just the weird stuff people do. I don't know what they're really thinking at the time. When I taught high school, I had a young woman who her last name was Priddy, Priddy, and her first name her parents gave her was Veri, very pretty. The problem was, true story, I don't know what they were thinking. I mean, why would you even take a gamble at that one? Or, another true story, the grown men I knew, they were triplets. They were triplets, triplet men, named Tom, Dick, and Harry. Cute, huh? Well, I think you get it. We all seem to have landed in the same spot. Naming is hard if you're a parent. Naming is important. Names are not something to be taken lightly. And naming today is probably nothing like naming was in other cultures and ancient civilizations. I mean, in other cultures they gave you names that may be tied to an event or tied to an activity. We know in Native American traditions that was the case, that you received a name based upon something, or you received a name based upon where you were from or who your family ties were before you had zip codes or area codes to know where people came from. So names had great significance. Moses, drawn from the water. Makes sense. Israel, from the Jacob narrative. Israel, a name for God. Striven, wrestled with God. The story of him wrestling with the angel and having his hip displaced. I have wrestled with God and lived. Israel. And, of course, the name we know, Yeshua, or Jesus. Yeshua being the Hebrew name, not particularly a special name. It was a very common Hebrew name, but it means God saves. God saves. So it has significance. God saves from sin. God saves from despair. God saves from hopelessness. We can read all of those things into that name. And of course, if you literally trans Yeshua or Jesus, it becomes Joshua. We were talking about midrash, name upon name, story upon story. Who was Joshua? The successor to the great lawgiver Moses. And what did Joshua do? He led the people of Israel from the wilderness into the promised land. You following me? All kind of wrapped up there in a powerful way in these stories. They mean much. But what's interesting to me as I reflected on that is that when you read the whole gospel narrative, you read the whole salvation story, even that name is not enough. We call him Jesus, correct? But as he lived and grew, as he went from an infant to a boy, to a young adult based upon who he was, how he acted, what he said, and what he did, the name Jesus was not enough. They attached to him additional names. They attached to him significant names. They called him Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Prince of Peace, Messiah, Savior, Christ, Son of God, Emmanuel. You see what I mean? Jesus is given a birth name, but that name, as he lived and grew, as people really knew him, didn't say enough. They had to say more. They had to add to it. Because the name Jesus could not contain nor fully express who they came to know him as. And that's very, very powerful as well. And as I pondered this, this is a time for resolutions, is it not? And sometimes we should change the S to a V. It's not time for personal resolutions. It is time for personal revolutions. Because the need is sometimes conflictual within us and more drastic. But as I thought about this, I could not help but wonder and reflect, and in some ways fear, the names that other people might attach to me. True. Because I too have a birth name, Keith, and it probably means something if you look it up. But over the course of my life, that is really not the name that matters. But the other ones, those that catch up with us, those that eventually live long after us, those that people and society and generations attach to us, the ones that really come to mind when others think about me, the ones that in the long run, perhaps the eternal run, the ones that really matter, kind and compassionate or harsh and critical. Loving and generous, or self-centered and thoughtless. Those two are names. Which ones come to mind? And I know that based on different times and situations for me, the names that would be attached to me probably would vary, depend upon the circumstances and instances. I mean, we all have encounters with people that probably aren't really true. But nonetheless, the images stick. But my point is, overall, what name is attached? Who am I, or more importantly, who will I be at the finish line? Who are you, and who will you be at that same point? And not just the name by which others know us, but the name, and most importantly, the name by which God knows us. What's the name by which God calls you? And we'd like to think that the name God knows us by is beloved or forgiven. But I'm not sure, speaking for myself, I'm not sure I've done anything really that would justify being given that. It appears to be in vogue these days as we flip through the many Christmas cards we got. But they are not Christmas cards so much anymore as they're Christmas letters. And they're quickly evolving in this age of high technology into Christmas pictures or postcards. And they often tell of interesting things people have done over the course of the year. But more and more, as I get those pictures, I find myself having to read it to know who I'm looking at. That's not, of course, my problem when we send pictures out, people. Obviously, I haven't changed in 30 years. Right? You know, you look at it and you go, who is that? Oh, that's who that is. I remember. You see, there's only so much we can do about appearances on the outside, how people know us, see us, remember us. But then there's that other level on the inside. What was our persona? What was our character? What was our spirit that emanates when we make that we get that identity in place? What then? And we have created a name. Have we created a name we are pleased with and proud of? And most importantly, is it worthy of having that name, child of God, or not? Because I believe that to have that name is the name we really seek, to live up to or to own or to receive the name of being a child of God is the significant one. But to have that comes with an obligation. It comes with an obligation. You know, when something's given to you, you receive it, and a gift can be given freely, but a gift also has the requirement of some kind of response, whether a thank you or I love you, or to put the gift into action. You put on a coat, you put on a shirt. Gifts always have a response. So to be called a child of God or beloved, to accept that name means there is some response needed from us. And it's not enough to just look at myself and say, well, I'm already living that way. Like a doctor who puts on a white coat and a stethoscope may have all the degrees and may have all the appearance of being a physician, but the physician I want is the one who sits by the bedside and talks to me and really listens to my heart. That's a doctor to me. You know? And so to be that beloved child has that obligation of saying, what am I doing to grow into that? And not simply taking it for granted. It's a way of our being and growing and becoming the face, think about this now, the face by which others see or do not see the face of God. That's heavy stuff. It's wonderful stuff, but it's heavy stuff. You see, one of the texts that I love most in the epistles is when it was all said and done, when Jesus' birth, his death, his resurrection, when that whole story is done, one of the letters of Paul says about his followers, they came to see in him the face of God. Because it seems to me that at that point, when they saw him in that fashion, that Jesus becomes the Christ, the beloved child of God. And that gift, and that honor, and that challenge, and that obligation is presented to us as well. I think that one of the greatest feelings of satisfaction, and I hope it isn't self-centeredness or egotistical, I really do, and so you can correct me, and some of you will, I know. But tell me if I'm wrong, but when you're with your children and somebody walks up to them and say, you know, they look just like you. Obviously, that's not a good thing out there. Huh? I don't know. When somebody says that to me, I usually smile because normally they say they look just like your mother. But when they say that, you know, I don't think about anything else. There's something good about that. There's something indescribable about that. And I don't know that maybe I am, but I would like to think that when we get it right, God feels the same way. They just look like you. Don't get it right all the time, but when we get it right, that the angels sing and dance and God smiles. So this is my New Year's question to you, which is maybe a New Year's challenge or revolution for you. Ask yourself, by what name do others know you? By what name do they really know you? And do you like it? Do you really own it? If you do, then build on it. That becomes the New Year's resolution. If you're kind, if you're generous, if you're compassionate, you can always be more. That's a wonderful thing about doing good. People can always become evil, right? You can always do worse things. You can always do better things, and we forget that. Do more. If you are not, then resolve to change it. Resolve to take on a better name. Because we had little, if any, influence over our birth names. We just kind of got those. But what I tell you is every day you have great impact and influence over your faith name. Your faith name, our face of God name. How the world sees us, and more importantly, how the world sees God through us. And this is a very good time to ask, if I could choose what my name would be, what will my name be? Because you can choose. And is the name you choose the name you would be called on by God? What is that? Because that's the name, ultimately, that truly matters. Amen.